My name is Marcy Souza, and I am the San Joaquin County UC Master Gardener Program Coordinator. And today's talk, we're going to talk about summer vegetable gardening. And I wanted to do this weekend because the weather is getting really warm and beautiful. And I know a lot of people are eager to get out in the garden and start getting things planted. So I thought let's have this class. Let's talk about some tips and tricks so that everybody getting ready to plant their summer vegetable garden will have the most success in having a very bountiful harvest this summer. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. And let's get it into. Okay, so summer vegetable gardening in San Joaquin County. Now, I did notice in the chat box that some of you are logging in from Southern California, from other states, other zones. And what the information that we're going to talk about, I think would apply to everybody. We're not going to get into specifics. So what we would do here in San Joaquin County and our planting zones would be different, obviously, than what you would do in Oregon and even San Diego, Long Beach, Southern California. And so I think this information will be helpful. It's, general gardening information, but not specific as far as planting specific crops. So I do have a couple of poll questions for you. I just realized I need to stop sharing so I can launch those poll questions. Okay, so the first one is, have you grown a summer vegetable garden before? And you can go ahead and answer that, and we'll give it about 30 seconds, and then I will close the poll and we'll see. So we've got lots of yeses. I love gardening and growing my own summer veggies. No, this is my first year. We've got some newbies, and we've got some people that have helped, but never have grown a garden before. I'm going to end the poll in 5 more seconds. Okay, so you can see majority of our today's participants have grown or had a summer vegetable garden before. Okay. All right, second question. I've got 3 questions for you. Where are you planting your garden? So we're going to talk a little bit about different types of vegetable gardens that you can have, but I'm curious what you are growing your vegetables in. So in-ground gardens, containers, raised beds, edible landscaping, which means you're incorporating vegetable plants in with pre-existing landscaping, or some other way that maybe I did not mention. We'll go about 5 more seconds. Okay, so we've got lots of raised beds, as you can see, and then in-ground gardens and container gardening are pretty close to being even on the other types of gardens. We do have some edible landscapers, which is fun. It's always fun to incorporate your veggie plants in with your pre-existing landscape. It's a great way to do that if you are limited on space. All right, last and final question, and then we will get going. I would like to know, what are you growing? And I just picked some of the more common summer vegetable items, but I'm curious to see what everyone is either planting or wanting to plant in their gardens this summer. And this one, you can pick more than one. Okay, we're going to go ahead and end the polling in 5 seconds. All right, we've got lots of tomato people in this class. Peppers, quite a few of you are growing or planning on growing peppers. Lots of zucchini and squashes. So great, all around, you guys are gonna have some well-rounded vegetable gardens this year and lots of yummy things that you'll be able to harvest from your garden. Okay, let me get my PowerPoint back up. Alrighty, so one thing that I want to mention is that everybody that signed up for today's class will be getting a survey sent from us. It's going to come from the statewide Master Gardener program. And what this does is when we offer classes like this, they're free to the public, we like to see how beneficial they were to you. We will not be sending this out next week. This is actually going to come out in 3 months. And so I hope you remember some of the things you learned. But the reason why we send it out 3 months from now is to make sure that you've had time to implement the information that you picked up at today's class and to see if you're actually using it. And we appreciate your feedback on these surveys. We provide this data to the county. This is what helps fund our program. And so we appreciate you taking the time to fill out the survey for us. Okay, usually I start off a presentation with things that we will be covering. Today we're going to talk about things that we won't be covering. I've received a lot of emails from people that have signed up for the class with questions, and I just wanted to get this out of the way in case anybody was anticipating learning about any of these topics. We are not going to cover vegetable pests or diseases. We will have a class on this sometime in mid to late April. We're not going to get into specific crops today. I'm not going to talk about specifically growing and planting tomatoes or zucchini, green beans, anything like that. We'll have a tomato class in early April. We're working on that right now. And that will be something where we will just focus just on tomatoes. And then if you have any other questions about growing specific crops, that's definitely something you could send to our Master Gardener volunteers in our helpline office. And I've also received some questions on how to make compost. This will be a class that our Master Gardener program will be offering in May. It's not something I'm going to talk about today as far as how to make it. We will talk about the benefits of using compost in your garden, but not the process of making compost. And one thing that I want to mention as far as questions go, I do have slides built into this PowerPoint to ask questions. So we'll stop and address any questions. Again, please remember we're going to use the chat box. And I forgot to introduce my helpers today. I've got 2 Master Gardener volunteers that are in today's class that are helping. We've got MG Katie and MG Sarah. And you'll notice our names have a capital M and G in front of it for Master Gardener. And so if you see their response in the chat box, you will know that those are San Joaquin County Master Gardeners answering your questions for you. Sometimes it gets a little hard to tell who's who when we're dealing with the chat box of, when we're asking questions and who's answering. So one of the things that I like to remind people when it comes to vegetable gardening is don't bite off more than you can chew, or in this case, more than you can hoe. If you're looking to start an exercise program, you wouldn't start day one by running a full marathon. You just wouldn't do it. You'd get frustrated, you'd get tired, you'd get sore, and you'd quit. And the same principle goes with vegetable gardening. You may have, these grandiose plans of having this beautiful, huge garden in your backyard, but you really need to look at it in a realistic view of, can you manage all that? Can you keep up with the weeds and the watering and the harvesting and managing pests? To have a successful garden, you don't want to get overran by weeds or maybe, aphids that come in and just, ruin your gardening experience. So if you're even just starting off with a raised bed or a pot, start off with what you can manage and then build up from there once you get the hang of it. If you're a new gardener or even a veteran gardener, sometimes, we get a little excited when we're shopping in the garden centers and bring home more than we need or want nowhere to put and can manage. So here are some things to consider when you are planning a vegetable garden. So the location, where are you going to put your garden? What do you want to grow? And do you have a plan? What's your plan for your garden? What plants do you want to grow? This is a great opportunity to get family involved. If you have young kids at home, what types of things does your family like to eat? What's maybe hard to find in grocery stores that you could grow? What things do your kids like to eat or grandkids like to eat, or what would they want to try? You need to consider your soil type. That plays a big role, and we're going to talk about that later. Are you starting from seeds or transplants? Now, we're a little late, we are late in starting certain crops from seeds like tomatoes and eggplants and peppers. We wanted to do that back in mid-February. So there's certain plants that we would start as transplants, but there's certain things that will also direct seed, and we'll talk about that later also. Your planting schedule. We have this handy, useful handout that you can see a picture of on my screen, but this tells you what to plant when. And knowing when to put things in the ground and when to expect a harvest, comes in really handy when you are planning your vegetable gardens, whether it's winter or summer. Type of garden. Again, if you don't have raised beds or containers or an in-ground section ready to go, what type of garden do you want to grow? And then time commitment. I'm not going to talk too much about this throughout the PowerPoint, but just remember that all gardening requires, there's weeding and watering, harvesting, like I said earlier, pest management. So those are all things you need to take into consideration. Are you going to be traveling a lot this summer where you're not going to be home to harvest your crops? And if that's the case, do you have a plan B where someone's going to come and take care of your garden for you and harvest things for you? All right, so what zone are we in? Sometimes I know this year, especially this last year with COVID, it feels like we might be in the twilight zone. But for those of you that don't know and that are in our area, we are in Sunset Zone 14. And there's a link where you can find your sunset zone if you are not in San Joaquin County. And I believe our Master Gardener helpers will be pasting some of these links in the chat box. And then for USDA, we are in Zone 9. And there's also a link where you can find your USDA planting zone. And this is really important because especially if you're online shopping in catalogs for seeds or plants, you want to make sure you are purchasing plants and seeds that will do well in our area. And we may have certain crops that will grow well here, but maybe only certain varieties. So I can throw out artichokes, for example. We can grow artichokes here, even though they are more of a coastal plant, but there are certain varieties that do better here in the valley with our heat. And that would be a great question for our Master Gardener office if you wanted to know, well, what varieties grow well here? But just make sure you're buying appropriate plants that will thrive in our dry and hot summer climate that we have. What are some resources available to you? So you have the Master Gardener programs. You have the San Joaquin County Master Gardener program if you're in our county. And if you're coming from other counties, it's most likely that your state or county also has a local Master Gardener program. If you don't know where it's at, you can find it on our statewide page, or you can just do an internet search, put in your county name and put UC Master Gardeners. Our website has a lot of great gardening information specific to vegetables. We have the vegetable basic handout guide, like we talked about, planting guides. And then you want to just make sure as you're looking for resources online that you're looking for reputable resources. So in a search online, you can always add UC or Master Gardeners to your search, and that will help filter research-based information to the top versus Farmer Joe's blog on his summer vegetable garden that he did and what worked for him, which may not be right for our area, or not the best information to go by. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the location. So you definitely want to plan on using the sunniest and the most well-draining location. Vegetables need 6 to 8 hours of sunlight a day, and they need soil that's going to drain well. You don't want saturated roots that are constantly wet. We call that wet feet. You want to make sure there's a convenient water source. So maybe the back corner of your yard is a great spot. It gets lots of sun. You don't have anything back there, but is there a hose bib nearby? Or are you going to have to carry buckets of water out to your garden to water it? And then what elements are in your yard that might affect your garden? So do you have tall trees, plants that might prohibit light from coming in during mid-afternoon? Do you have buildings and fences that might cause too much shade or too much heat? A lot of times, brick homes, stucco homes, if you plant your garden too close to that, the heat can radiate off of your home and can cook your plants in your garden beds. Do you have pets that you need to think about? So, as you're planting things in, is the dog or the cat going to come and bother your garden? And along with pets, I'd add maybe known rodent type pests. Do you know that you have possums or skunks or squirrels, rabbits, things like that in your yard that you would need to protect your plants from? Because they will definitely come and find your veggies, especially those new transplants that you put in the garden. Okay, planning your garden. So before you want to do this, before you go to the garden center, figure out where the garden's going and then make a map. Figure out how much real estate you're working with and whether it's a raised bed, whether it's pots, figure out how many pots that you have that are in good condition that you can plant in, what the area in your backyard, maybe if you're planting in the ground, and draw in some vegetables or make a list of vegetables that you would like to plant. You may know this, you may have to wait till you go to the nursery, but consider the spacing requirements. So whether you're planting by seeds, ordering out of catalogs, or buying in person, they'll all have information on the plant tag or on the labels that tell you how far apart plants need to be spaced. And that is really important. Don't cram in those squash and those tomato plants. They need room to grow, they need good air circulation. So keep that in mind. Do you really have room to plant pumpkins this year? Because those are going to take a lot of space as they're vining and crawling. Or do you want to save that space for something else, and grow some zucchini and green beans and eggplant or something? And then as you're planting your garden, it's best if you can to work compost and or fertilizers like manures and things like that into the soil at least, a couple of weeks. If you can do it a month before, that is ideal before you're planting. You don't want to incorporate, especially manures. Compost, it's not the end of the world, but manures, you don't want to put manures in the soil and then plant directly as soon as you incorporate that manure into the soil. You want to give it time to break down and incorporate itself into the soil. Okay, record keeping. You definitely want to keep track, because trust me, you won't remember. I, have even planted seeds and thought, oh, I'll remember which end was which or what plants went in what order. And as soon as they start sprouting, I don't remember which one were the bell peppers versus which one were the jalapeno peppers. And then it's a surprise when I plant them. So do some record keeping. Keep track of the varieties that you grew. This will help whether you like them or not. You can make notes along the way, put in your planting dates and your harvest dates. Whether, I'm not saying do a daily log, but we've warmed up pretty quick in the 80s this week and next week. Do we have a drop in nighttime temperature that maybe you want to record? It is, getting close to April, but we have had frost temperatures in mid-April before. So we're not necessarily out of the weather 100% yet for really cold conditions at night. Where did you plant your garden? Add photographs. Did you like whatever you grew? Did it do well? And then any special notes you have as far as spacing, trellising, what pests you encountered that year is always helpful. And here's just some easy ways that you can do some record keeping. You could have a binder with some clear inserts, a notebook, some colored pencils if you wanted to make it pretty. If you go online and just search garden journals or garden record keeping, there's printables that you can purchase, or some of them are even free to download. There's garden log books that you can purchase. Many Master Gardener programs have one. We have our own record keeping journal from our Master Gardener program that's available to buy. And you can even do just something as easy as a notebook where you tape in the labels or the seed packets and then just write some notes and do some sketching. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be fancy, but just keep track of your garden and it'll definitely help for next year. And don't forget to label your plants. So this goes for seeding as well as plants that you put in the ground. And again, I wanted to show you just some fun ways that you can make your own plant labels. We've got some canning lids. So if you're a canner, you can use used lids. We don't want to reuse those for canning, but you can turn those into plant labels. Paint sticks, we've got some wine corks, clothespins, plastic forks, and even mini blinds that somebody took out and they cut up to make their own plant labels, markers. And just make sure, I like the paint stick idea, but for those maybe on the back side, I would put what variety of tomato. So tomatoes and then, mortgage breaker or something like that if you're growing an heirloom, just so you know which plants are which. But I thought these are all really easy ways to individually and cost effectively label your plants in your garden. All right, so up until this point, do we have any questions, my Master Gardener ladies, that anybody has that I need to answer? Katie, you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you.
Adrienne would like to know about getting a copy of the presentation. I know it's being recorded, but will a copy be available?
Good question. So we are recording this today, and then we will share it with everybody that signed up. I will email everybody once the video is ready to go, along with the links that are currently being posted in the chat box and some other resources. So we'll email all of that out to everybody so that if you wanted to re-watch this video, you have access to that, as well as some of the resources that I'm talking about.
Someone else asked if veggies were being planted yet in the edible garden at the Ag Center.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
We're not planting anything yet out there.
I think that's it so far.
Okay, let's keep going forward then. All right, what type of soil do you have? So in the chat box, I'm curious just to see what type of soil do you guys have? Do you know? Do you have, you know, clay soils, sandy soils? Go ahead and add in the chat box. Let's just see what everyone's working. No clue. Okay. We're going to learn how to find out. Okay, we have some raised beds, so you're amending your soil and kind of making your own. Okay, great. Well, why does this matter? Why does your soil type matter? Let's first find out how to determine your soil type. So what you want to do is you want to take a handful of soil, you want to get it wet. You don't want it sopping where there's water just dripping, you know, from in between your fingers, but you want to get it moist, and you want to have about a 1-inch ball. So think back, you know, Play-Doh days, and you want to kind of roll that into a ball and then start feeding that soil through your fingers. And you'll kind of, see if I can do this like this, you'll kind of just ribbon. We call that soil ribboning. And you're gonna rub it and feel it and see what it feels like. So if you have sandy soil, it's going to feel gritty. It's going to be loose and it won't form a ball. So you're not going to be able to roll, you know, a ball, 1-inch ball with it. And you're going to feel that sand. If you have a loamy soil, which this is ideal if you're able to get this, it's going to feel smooth and slick, but you're going to feel just a little grit, but it's still going to be sticky. So it's not going to be as crumbly as sandy. It's going to stick together a little bit because it does have some clay, but you're still going to feel that grittiness. And then if you have clay soil, it's going to stick together very easy. It's almost going to feel tacky, kind of sticky. It's not going to crumble apart. And if you were ribboning it, you would just be able to, you know, keep ribboning for a while and make a long soil ribbon. And that's just one way of just doing a feel test. And this is a visual. So if you have sandy soil, you're going to know you have sandy soil because it does not hold water. And on the extreme opposite end, if you have clay soil, you know you have clay soil because you grow 2 inches just by walking in wet dirt. If you're walking around out in your garden in the winter, because all that soil sticks to your shoes. But you can kind of see the in between a loamy sand and a clay loam of what those would look like and how they would stick together as you're squeezing them in your hand. So why does soil type matter? It matters because the biggest thing, it matters often how often you have to irrigate or water your garden. So again, I mentioned sandy soil does not hold on to water. It goes through very quickly. It also affects the speed of your watering. So if you're hose watering, you know, with sandy soil, you want to keep that in mind as that water is going through the soil fast. It's also going to dry out fast at the top of the soil. If you have a clay soil, you're gonna want to water it slower and longer because you're going to let that water seep into the soil. You don't want it puddling on top. You want it soaking down into the root zone of the plants. Your soil type is going to affect fertilizing, and it's also going to affect when and how you work your soil. So, you know, if you have clay soil, once you stick that shovel in, you know, if it hasn't had time to dry out yet, it's going to be really wet. It's going to stick to the shovel, and we don't want to be working the soil when it's still wet. So that is one of the reasons why we want to make sure it's the right time to be planting. Healthy soil equals healthy plants. So we're looking at feeding the life in the soil to make healthy soil. And if we have healthy soil, then our vegetable plants will thrive and do really well. Healthy soil also produces healthy plants, and healthy plants help to fend off diseases and pests more successfully. And, you know, we just want to have healthy plants because the old saying of you are what you eat. So the better your plants are, the better the food is that's coming off of it, and the better it is for you. Okay, so adding compost. Here's some of the benefits of adding compost. So if you have issues with pH levels, it can help to balance pH levels in your soil, whether it's very acidic or if you have alkaline issues, it can help balance that out. Adding compost can help prevent water runoff. So it helps with the soil and moisture absorption in the soil. It can help with water infiltrating the soil because especially if you have like a clay soil, it can help break up that clay soil to allow some air pockets. And then complete opposite with sandy soil, it gives some binding where the sand sticks to the compost and allows some water to be retained in the soil before it all seeps through the ground. Compost can help create stronger roots. It can help enhance flower and fruit production, which reduces your reliance on different types of fertilizers. Compost is great if we're having a drought, which it looks like we are headed into a very dry summer and we're going to have some water restrictions this year. So compost is great to add to your garden to help reduce the amount of watering that you do need to do out in the garden. So just a rule of thumb, one question that we get a lot of is, well, how much compost do I need to add to the garden? And a good rule of thumb is to mix in 1 cubic yard of compost for about every 300 square feet of garden space that you are working with. And if you're still not sure, if you do a quick internet search, you can find compost calculators online. Just look for compost calculator. You put in your square footage. You can put in by inches. You know, I want to add 2 inches of compost to my garden. And then it'll tell you how many cubic yards, how many bags of compost that you need to purchase to add to your garden. So just look for compost calculator online if you're still not sure. All right, fertilizing vegetables. So primarily vegetables need nitrogen. That's like the main macronutrient that vegetables will typically need. But they benefit definitely from complete fertilizers. So a complete fertilizer is just, if you're looking at a box or a bag, it has 3 numbers on it that are above 0. An incomplete fertilizer would have a 0 for, if it had a 0.55, that means there's no nitrogen in that bag. So that's an incomplete fertilizer. Complete fertilizers are like the examples below, a 5, 10, 5. You always want to make sure you follow the directions on your fertilizer. And consider light, nitrogen applications every 3 to 4 weeks, monthly, every month and a half, even after you've planted your veggies in the garden. Try not to let your fertilizer touch the stems of your plants. You want to spread it out more at like the leaf line of the plants. We call that some side dressing, and then it'll get watered in and worked into the soil. But you don't want to burn the roots or the stem by placing it too close to the plant itself. And don't let your fertilizer get wet. It'll clump and just turn into a solid mass. So keep it dry, keep it in a dry place in your garage, in a shed, away from pets and kids and things like that. Fertilizing vegetables, again, I talked about this at the beginning. If you are adding any type of manure, you want to put that in before you plant your garden. You're looking at like a month before. Steer manures are available at garden centers. That's already been processed usually. It's already ready to go in the garden. Again, you don't want to plant directly after it, but give it a few weeks to work itself into the garden. If you have access to fresh manure, so maybe somebody has a rabbit or chickens, chicken manure has a lot of nitrogen. We call that hot manure. And that is definitely something that you would not want to spread around your plants. It can burn them, it'll fry your plants, it can kill them. And you definitely want to give those types of manures that have not had time to sit. You know, if you're cleaning out the chicken coop and putting it into the garden, you want to give yourself at least a good month before you plant anything into that area. And then you can also purchase crop specific fertilizers. You'll see plant food out there specifically for tomatoes, and it'll tell you, when you should add it and how often, how much. Just make sure you follow that. Just a quick, I get questions. a lot on what do those numbers stand for. So just a quick run through the first number, which is nitrogen, that leads to healthy vegetative growth. So often we'll see, people adding grass clippings in their gardens, which is high nitrogen, or, people will even bury, plant or food left scraps from their kitchen, which is all high nitrogen. And I don't recommend that. I recommend putting it in the compost pile and adding it as a finished compost. But adding a lot of nitrogen will produce that green growth. And sometimes we get excessive green growth. So you just want to be cautious of how much nitrogen you are adding to your plants. It also, nitrogen also leads to the green we see in plants. So a lot of times if plants are deficient, we'll have a yellowing. Phosphorus is the P on the bag, it's the middle number, and this is crucial in photosynthesis, which is what helps us produce our fruit, and essential in root growth and flower production and flower setting. So if you are, if you're adding just a nitrogen fertilizer, you're missing out on, having some really healthy roots and flowers that are going to be productive. And then the last number is potassium, or K, and that's the overall just health and vigor. It's kind of their daily vitamin. If we're looking, we take a daily vitamin just for overall health. Potassium is the plant's daily vitamin and helping fighting diseases and your fruit quality or vegetable quality of what you're harvesting. And then just a quick, what do those numbers mean? So it is the percentage of numbers, the percentage of nutrients in that bag. So for example, a bag with 10, 10, 10 would contain 10% of each nutrient, and then the other 70% would be filler or other nutrients, but it would contain 10% of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. 5, 10, 5 bag would be 5% nitrogen, 10 phosphorus, and 5 potassium. And then 80% would be filler or other nutrients, micronutrients, things like that. All right, any questions about soil, composting, or fertilizers, Katie?
Coffee and tea browns, can they go directly into the garden? I'm assuming they should go into a compost pile.
Ideally, they should go into a compost pile. They are, again, those are high nitrogen amendments. So that's something that we see a lot. People will sprinkle their coffee grounds around the garden. There's nothing wrong with it, but you're adding a lot of nitrogen to the plants. And then you can get that excessive green growth, and then it can throw off the balance of, say, your tomatoes growing, where you're gonna have a lot of green, bushy leaves. It's gonna get really tall and beautiful. And then, maybe it's not producing much because we're missing some of those other nutrients.
There's also a couple of questions about bunny poop and whether it's considered hot. I'm assuming it needs to
It still needs to sit. So any type of animal manure needs to process. And I say any type, and then I am going to throw out this clause. You do not want to use cat or dog manures in your garden ever. Even if you've let them sit, that is not something that you want to put into your soil, especially in plants that you are going to be consuming. But horse, cow, chicken, rabbit, all of it needs to sit and process. And then if you're adding it directly to the soil straight from the coop, you definitely don't want to plant in it for like a month. But I would consider all of those, we just know chicken manure is really hot. But I wouldn't add horse manure or rabbit manure directly to the plants either. I'd let that sit and process and then work it into the soil.
So there's a question here about what percentage fertilizer to buy.
You're just looking for a complete fertilizer. Again, if you're growing tomatoes, it wouldn't be a bad idea to buy a specific fertilizer for tomatoes, because it's going to be balanced for what tomatoes typically need to have a good fruit set, flower, blossom set, healthy roots. So there's not really a magic number. I just wanted to put the fertilizers out there so that you're aware of what you're purchasing and what those different fertilizers do for the plant. But there's not, one set number that you're looking for out in the garden.
Do you recommend in using both fertilizer and compost in the garden?
Yeah. So again, compost, we're really looking at compost feeding the soil, and fertilizers, we tend to look at fertilizers feed the plant. Now, yes, there's nutrients and things that the plants may be able to pull, out of the compost, but the compost is really to improve the soil quality, to feed the biological, the critters that are living in the soil, all feed off the compost, and it does, help support plant growth, but we're really, think of compost as feeding the soil and then fertilizer feeding the plants.
We have some vermicomposters here. People are asking about worm castings.
Yeah. So worm castings are considered processed. Once the worm has worked that through its body, they're ready to go, and those can be sprinkled around plants. Again, I wouldn't sprinkle them right up against your plant, or you could sprinkle some in the bottom of your hole as you're planting. But that is something that has been processed and is available if you're producing your own worm castings, or if you purchase worm castings, it can go directly into your garden.
Okay. Can you over fertilize?
You definitely can over fertilize. So that's why it's very important to read the label. More is not better. So if it says to add, a tablespoon, don't add 3 tablespoons. You can burn your plants. So you can, fertilizers have salts in them. So if you over fertilize, you can add salts to your soil, build up that salinity in your soil, and then you're going to see that in burns on your leaves. And too much salt, too much fertilizer can kill your plants. And then again, if we're adding, like I said, a lot of nitrogen to the soil, you're going to get this excessive green growth, and then the plant's never going to focus on producing flowers and fruits, things like that. So you definitely can over fertilize.
Someone asks about the best soil for raised beds.
So for raised beds, you don't want to use garden soil because that is going to get too compacted. So don't dig it out. If you have property or some room in the back of your garden where you've got extra soil, don't dig out garden soil, ground soil to put into a raised bed. You want that water to be able to infiltrate and the roots to be able to infiltrate in that soil. They do sell at nurseries and big box stores, planting mixes. I would definitely recommend mixing that with compost so that you've got a good blend of a potting, growing type soil, they even sell raised garden bed soil, and then add some compost to that and kind of make your own blend. We'll take one more question if you've got it, and then we'll move on.
I think that's about it.
Okay, so let's go ahead and keep on going. All right, so if you're starting from seeds, so again, I did mention that we are it's too late right now to start thinking about tomatoes and peppers, eggplants, things like that from seeds. But for future reference, if you're starting from seeds, some of the benefits are you do get more variety in what you can grow. You find varieties that maybe the nurseries aren't selling, that you can't get. They're cheaper to buy a bag of seeds than to buy, a 6-pack of plants. You get a lot more seeds for the money that you spend in equivalent to buying transplants. You know how they're grown. You're the one growing it. I think personally that growing seeds is fun. It's fun to watch them sprout. It's fun to take care of them and nurture them, especially if you have kids or grandkids. They like watering and taking care of the plants. You do need to plan ahead of time. So for example, you'd want to order your seeds so that you are ready to plant your tomatoes in mid-February. Valentine's Day is kind of my time frame for planting those tomato seeds, and again, peppers, eggplants, everything in that family. And they do require more care for a longer time period. So that's something that if you're going to be on vacation for 2 weeks, you might not want to start seeds, because who's going to water them? Who's going to take care of them? And it does take a little more commitment than just purchasing transplants from the nursery. If you are saving your seeds or from your plants, or if you have leftover seeds that you didn't need, you can store those in a sealed bag in your fridge, and that will help them last longer. I have a master gardener that had seeds in his refrigerator for over 10 years, and they would still germinate in his garden. Granted, the germination rate does go down each year, so you're not going to get 100% germination success from every seed that you plant. That's why we typically want to overseed, and then we can thin out the runts. But you can keep seeds for a long time in the refrigerator. And if you're saving your own seeds, you want to keep those from plants that have been open pollinated, but not hybrids. And that's because hybrids are hybridized with different varieties. And just because you save the seeds from a yellow crookneck zucchini does not mean you are going to get a yellow crookneck zucchini when you plant that seed next year. You could get whatever the other parent plant was, and it could be a dark green 8-ball zucchini. You never know. And then you want to buy good quality seeds, varieties. Again, pay attention to our climate zones. And then it's always fun to shop online or in gardening catalogs. And they do tell you a lot of good information as far as spacing, germination, harvest, things like that. That's important to keep in mind. So if you're starting seeds, your soil media should be fined, airy. You don't want to use garden soil. Again, it's too heavy, too dense. The little baby roots are not going to be able to work their way into the soil. You'd want to buy a commercial potting mix specifically for seed starting. Seeds germinate best between 65 and 75. So we're looking at inside, we're looking at a greenhouse, something with a heat pad or lights. You want to keep them moist. So you want to also keep in mind gently watering, maybe like with a spray bottle, and not washing away those seeds. And then again, like I said, they do need adequate light, lamps, windows. If you are keeping seeds in a windowsill, make sure you move them away at night because that glass can get very cold and that can be detrimental to tender young seedlings. All right, as you're getting ready to, maybe you started your seeds and you've got some transplants, you do not want to take those directly from indoors where it's been nice and cozy to outside into the ground. You want to do a process that's called hardening off. And what this does is when the plants reach about 2 to 4 inches tall, when your tomato is about 4 inches tall, you want to start taking them outside, put them on a table, put them on your patio, and gradually increase the amount of time that they are outside. This will help get them acclimated to the outdoor environment, to wind, to the change in weather, and then they won't have such a shock when you put them into the ground. Planting depth and seed size. So I think the most common issue, we get a lot of questions of, I planted seeds and they didn't grow. And so I'll ask somebody, well, how deep did you plant them? And they'll hold up their finger and they'll point, I planted them this deep, way too deep for most of our seeds. So you typically are not going to be planting your seeds any more than 2 to 3 times deep the size of the seed. So think of like a corn seed, which is basically a corn kernel, or a green bean seed. Those you would plant maybe, to the line on your finger, but something like tomato seeds, radishes, you're really almost just sprinkling those on top of the soil and then adding, a light dusting the soil on top of it. And then again, gently watering that so that you don't wash those tiny seeds away. Make sure you overseed. And then when it comes time to thinning, you have to be ruthless. Keep that spacing in mind, whatever the seed packet said, whatever the catalog said. You don't want to, just because they all came up and as hard as it is, you don't want to have them all grow because those plants need their space. The roots will become intertangled together, and they're just not going to do well if they don't have that correct spacing. All right, if you are working with transplants, some benefits of transplants are they save space. So you're not going to have to dedicate half your kitchen table, maybe to growing seeds. You can possibly have an earlier start time. So maybe you're growing in containers and you can, get a head start on planting, but maybe your seeds wouldn't be ready. So, being able to go to a nursery and purchase transplants that you could plant directly into a pot or something has its benefits. Uniform growth. So sometimes our seeds don't always germinate at the same time, and they're going to be at different heights, different stages of growth. Typically, when you're buying, a 6-pack of plants or even singles, the growth and the size is going to be very similar. You can minimize early pest problems, so things that attack young seedlings. The nurseries have already done that for you. Some things to consider is that you could be bringing home diseases or weeds that came from that nursery that grew those plants. You do have a limited selection of varieties, and they can, like I said, be more expensive than buying seeds. When you are buying transplants, some things to keep in mind is you want to make sure that your roots are healthy and intact. So I have purchased plants before, brought them home, pulled them out, and the whole plant basically just came out with these little dinky, hairline size roots coming out of it. So you want to make sure you've got a good, healthy root system on it, like the one in the picture. All those white roots are great. Everything's nice and tight and compact. On the flip side of that, you don't want long roots growing out of the bottom of the package where you're going to have to cut those out. That's almost like a root bound plant, and that's a little too much. If you're buying bundles of vegetables like onion sets or something like that, you want to make sure that the roots have good color, they're not mushy, they don't smell bad, they're not rotting. You want to make sure your plants are disease and insect free. So if they're already yellowed or have stripy leaves or cool mottled designs on the leaves or little critters crawling around, don't take those home to your garden. And again, avoid, real spindly plants or spotted, oversized, overgrown plants. Just take a look at your plants before you bring them home. You want to protect, whether you're growing from seeds or transplants, protect those seedlings, protect those transplants. So they do need some protection from, really windy days, again, cold temperatures at night, sunburn. You can use shade cloth or frost cloth if needed, if we do get some crazy excessive heat coming our way where those plants are going to get stressed, or again, if we drop in temperatures at night. In cooler weather, don't forget, you still need to water your plants. Just because it's cool out, they still need a drink of water. And garden pests are out there, whether you can see them or not. So you want to make sure that you're keeping an eye on them and preventing those however you may need to, depending on what you're dealing with. So here's just some fun ways to protect your plants. If you're direct seeding into the ground and you've got some young plants coming up, you can use some 1/2 gallon, 1 gallon milk jugs. You can leave the cap on. You can pop that cap off to provide some more air. But this is not something that you want to leave on 24/7, especially on warm days, because it'll just cook those plants. So this is more, for protection at night, or definitely take them off during the hot part of the day and then put them back on if you're trying to protect from snails or birds, things like that, rabbits. And then here you see the other picture, they've got some water bottles or, juice bottles, any type of plastic bottle, where you can cut the bottom off, keep the top off, and put those around for little mini greenhouses for your plants. You can, if you're trying to protect from sunburn or pests. So that first picture of the pepper plant actually has an upside down tomato cage on it that they wrapped with some shade cloth, and that helps keep moths out. It helps keep birds and things like that, and as well as protecting it from the sun. The middle picture is an upside down strawberry basket. That's great for protecting from birds and rabbits. Small insects obviously can crawl through the little holes, but larger pests. And then, our valley heat here in July and August, when we are growing, we've got fruits of peppers and tomatoes. I'm sure if you've grown those before, I've gone out to be totally disappointed to find a big sunburn mark on those, items. And I've seen people put up pop-up tents over their garden, patio umbrellas, like this beach umbrella. So you definitely want to think about providing some shade for your plants in our hot summer months if sunburn is an issue. All right, any questions, Katie, about seeds or transplants?
A couple of people have asked about sprouting seeds before planting them.
I don't think that's necessary. I like on a wet paper towel is what I'm guessing, where they've got. Yeah, I think if you're direct seeding things, then you just want to go ahead and put those directly into the ground. I mean, you could if you want to take the time, but then you have to make a hole, for the roots. And me personally, I would just seed heavy and then thin out the plants.
Okay, and there's another one, whether you can plant earlier in a raised bed versus in ground.
So we're going to talk about that, but to answer that question right now, sometimes you can. The soil temperature is the main thing that we're looking at. And I'm going to talk about the benefits of raised beds, in ground, all the different types here in a little while. But yeah, you typically raised beds and containers even usually have a 1-up on raised beds of that soil temperature warming up faster where you can plant sooner. But we want our temperatures to be about 65 degrees is what we're looking at. And we're going to we'll dive into more of that here in a little bit.
Thank you.
Okay. So planting your garden. I mentioned this is really important though. You want to avoid working your soil if it's still too wet. This can lead to compaction of soil, and that's just not something, it's not worth doing it just to get your plants in, a week ahead of time or something. Also in your garden, when we're talking about compaction, if you can designate trails, especially if you're planting in the ground, minimize the area that you're walking throughout your garden. So you could lay cardboard down, maybe some bark, straw, or just have paths throughout your garden. And that will also help with soil compaction, for future gardens that maybe you want to plant. When you're planting your garden, again, we've talked about this, but it's important, add compost, manures, other soil amendments, at least a couple of weeks to a month if possible, before you plant your plants in the ground. And we talked about excessive salts from fertilizers and hot manures already. All right, plant for sun exposure. So this is something to keep in mind. You can plant your taller plants, so say you're planting corn or even something like tomatoes. You can plant those on the south side of smaller plants to avoid shading. Or if you want to do the opposite, maybe you're looking to shade some plants and you'd flip that around and you'd want to plant the taller plants on the north side. But just kind of keep the orientation. I've seen people plant gardens before and then their, poor peppers are shaded out by something that's taller, or maybe they did a trellis, vertical gardening of some kind, and then that shades out whatever it is that they're trying to grow, and it will never get enough sun. So just think about the sun exposure and the way the sun moves in your yard. And again, remember trees, fences, go out in your yard several times a day to see where's the sun, at throughout the day and where would be the best place, as well as orientation for your garden. Consider the last and first frost date. So in our county, in San Joaquin County, usually mid-November, we'll get a frost. And what does that mean? What's important to know for cold vegetable gardening, cold season crops, but also to me, that means that typically my tomatoes and peppers will keep producing here until mid-November. The important one right now that we're looking at is the first frost date. So I think we're at like a 10% chance at the end of March for a frost. But just keep in mind that we have had frost into early and mid-April. So, if the weather foreman says there's a freeze or a frost coming, it could happen. You just want to make sure you protect those plants that you have out in the garden. This just shows you an impact of the planting date. So we talked about that planting chart of what to plant when, and the plants on the left, the peas on the left, were planted October 18th, and then you can see the difference of where that same type of plant is by planting them a month later, November 18th. So the ones that were planted at the right timing of October 18th definitely had a better start. And this picture was taken in February. So you can see the difference of come November, it was just getting too cold. The soil temperature, day, sunlight, all those effects or factors, played an effect on how well the plants did. The same thing could be kept in mind for summer vegetable gardens. My biggest pet peeve is seeing summer vegetable plants in garden centers, in early March, even into February, you'll see them. It's not the right time. Just because the nurseries have them does not mean you should be planting them. And, planting plants too early can stunt the plants. They'll just sit there. If it's too cold, they're not going to thrive. They're not going to grow. They're not going to do anything. And you don't really get a benefit from planting them any earlier in your garden. Succession planting is a trick that you can do. And what this does is it allows your harvest to extend throughout the season. So if you were to plant 8 rows of corn all at the same time, you're going to have 8 rows of corn ready at the same time. And so what we recommend doing is succession planting, and that will extend your harvest every 2 weeks throughout the summer. You can do the same thing if you're seeding your own plants. So, plant maybe 2 rows and then wait 2 weeks, plant another 2 rows, and that will give you transplants to plant throughout the season. And then you can also do this with plants in the garden. Typically our garden centers will have transplants available, at least into the start of summer. You could plant squash, when you start your garden, and then plant another round of squash, save some room for some more zucchini. I know in my experiences, the zucchini, I harvest, and then the plant just kind of usually fizzles, and that's it. The zucchini harvest is done. Whereas if I had another zucchini that I planted 2 weeks later, I would continually have, zucchini to harvest throughout the summer. Now, whether I want that or not, I might be sick of the zucchini by then, but at least it extends my harvest of whatever it is that you're growing throughout the season. Crop rotation is very important. You need to make it a habit to change where you plant your crops each year. And this goes for containers as well as raised garden beds. So you don't want to plant the same thing in the same spot in the same soil every year. And that also goes for things in the same family. And I'm going to show you a slide to kind of talk about that a little bit more. But what this does is by rotating our crops, it allows nutrients that maybe a plant like tomatoes is a really heavy nitrogen feeder. It's going to pull a lot of nitrogen out of the soil. By planting something else there the next year, maybe a type of bean, green beans, those are nitrogen fixers. So they're going to be adding nitrogen back to the soil. We're not depleting the soil of all the nutrients. It also really helps in warding off insects and diseases. A lot of insects will overwinter in the soil. Tomato hornworms right now are hanging out in your soil waiting for it to warm up. They're going to look like a brown football in the soil with a little tail that'll wiggle. And once the weather gets right, those puppies will be coming out and devouring your tomato plants. So if we are moving our crops around, when those pests come out, they're not going to have a host plant to feed off of. And then it also, like I said, a lot of diseases, fusarium wilts, things like that can overwinter in the soil, but maybe might not affect a different type of crop. So it's just best to move those crops around as much as possible. Any questions, Katie?
Shoot, I didn't unmute myself, sorry. That nurseries, big box stores have transplants available way too early.
Yeah.
And is it okay to buy them and then just hold on to them until it's a good time to plant?
Yes, and I think so. The only thing that you may need to keep in mind when you are doing that is, a lot of times the plants in the nurseries are really healthy and they may outgrow their container. So say you bought one, some tomatoes or something. I keep picking on tomatoes, but say you bought a vegetable, 6-pack or individual pot back in late February, you might need to repot those into something bigger so that they have adequate room to keep growing.
Okay.
Definitely buy those and then just take care of them as if you grew them.
Okay, and there are a couple of questions related to crop rotation. Somebody asks if tilling destroys pests in the soil.
Tilling could possibly destroy pests in the soil. It depends if the pests were tilled, and it's only, the smaller the pest, the less likely that tilling would destroy those pests. So I wouldn't use tilling. Tilling also can add to compaction and affecting the soil particles and things like that. So I wouldn't say because you till your soil that you don't need to consider crop rotation. It doesn't affect, diseases and things like that. So definitely want to keep in mind, keep doing crop rotation if possible.
Well, and related to that, someone is asking how many years you can plant tomatoes in the same place.
You want to try to rotate those every year, if possible. And let me see. I think we have, Katie, do you have that link that you can, or Sarah, do you have the link? I can't see my chat box. So we do have a link on crop rotation and it shows what plants are in the same family. So for example, when I'm talking about not planting tomatoes in the same spot every year, that also goes for peppers, eggplants, potatoes. They're all in the same family. So you wouldn't want to plant any of those in that same spot. You'd want to rotate around with something in, like the cucumber family, for example, or a legume of some kind. So there's a whole chart that we have access to, and we'll be sending that to you when we send out the link to this video of what families you want to rotate and what crop rotation looks like.
Okay, I think that, is it too early to be planting tomatoes now?
Well, that's why I want to do this class, because I have a feeling people are going to be out this weekend planting. So you want your soil, I talk about this a little bit later, but you want your soil temperature to be 65 degrees. I think we're going to start getting there as, again, the weather's warming up, but I know people that planted their vegetables 2 weeks ago, and they're probably most likely just sitting in the ground. They're not going to be doing a lot of growing. So take in mind, what the weather forecast looks like and what your soil temperature is. Just because it's warm outside, soil thermometers are a great investment. You can find them online, and you would just stick that into the soil to see, where your soil temperature actually is.
Okay, thank you.
All righty, I'm battling this.
Marcy, there are a couple questions about raised beds. If you replace the soil in the raised beds, can you grow tomatoes?
You want to, and we're going to talk about that when we get to raised beds. I will address those questions here in a little bit. All right, let's keep going. Get my screen to advance. Okay, so now let's talk about watering. A lot of times, we get Master Gardener office gets a lot of questions on how to water, how often do I water, and it's really there's a lot of variables on watering. So it's going to depend on the type of vegetable you're growing, your soil types. Again, clay soils hold on to water longer than sandy soils do. And what's your garden type? Are you in a container? Are you in the ground? Are you in a raised bed? How are you watering? Are you watering with a hose, with drip irrigation system? You definitely don't want to water with a sprinkler when it comes to watering. That's the one you definitely want to avoid, is overhead watering. But all of those factors come into play on how to water. There's not a magic number to tell people on how much they need to water their vegetable garden. So we do have some help though, some things to keep in mind. So deeper rooted plants such as tomatoes need less water. They definitely don't need to be watered every day. But when you do water them, you want to water them for a longer period of time. So slower water, let that water really have time to sink down deep into the soil to get to the root zone. Shallower rooted crops typically will need more water, but not as long, because again, their roots are not as deep, but that water is going to evaporate and dry out of the soil faster than the water that reached those tomato roots. You're looking to try to water the soil to about 18 inches at your watering. That's a good number. If you're just looking, I've got shallow and deep rooted crops, or maybe you don't know, how deep those roots go, aim for 18 inches. And, a good way is if you can get a stick or something to stick into the ground and see how wet the soil is at how deep. If it stops at 6 inches, you need to water more and maybe slow down that watering if you're having puddling issues on top of the soil. So here's just some help of what are some shallow, moderate, and deep rooted crops. So in ideal soils, these are like the best conditions, cabbage, cauliflower, you see all those listed, those roots can go 1 to 2 feet deep for all those crops. Moderately rooted include plants like cucumbers, eggplants, your squashes and zucchinis. And then deep rooted, we're looking at, some more of those perennial type crops, and crops that like tomatoes will go deep, watermelon, cantaloupe, all have the possibility of going anywhere from 2 all the way down to 6 feet deep for those roots. Again, given in the perfect ideal soil conditions in your garden. But just keep that in mind as you're watering, that, oh, my tomatoes need more water, deeper watering than those bell pepper plants. Watering consistency. So it's very important to be consistent with watering. And I said I'm not going to get into diseases of plants, but I'm just going to touch on this one. So blossom end rot can happen to anything in this family. Tomatoes, bell peppers, eggplants can get this. And it's an end result of irregular watering. So it's not necessarily the watering that did this, but there's calcium that comes into play. And again, we'll talk about blossom end rot more in detail at our tomato class. But this is the end result of this kind of like roller coaster watering, where you weren't consistent with the frequency, the watering depth, the time, and the end result can be this brown leathery spots on the bottom of your tomatoes due to inconsistent watering. So that's my big takeaway, is just be consistent. It may be hot, you may not want to go out there, but you need to go out there and give those plants a drink. So any questions? That was a kind of a quick little chapter on watering, but any questions about watering?
Just one, do you recommend any particular time of day for watering?
So you don't want to water, in the hottest part of the day, because the plant, a lot of that water is going to evaporate. So early morning watering or early evening. Again, we don't want to do any overhead watering where we're getting the leaves wet or the fruits, the tomatoes wet, for example. You want to give, if you water at night, you want to do it where the plants will have enough time, or the soil will have enough time to kind of soak in and start to dry out so that you don't get disease issues and things like that. But if you have proper spacing where you've got good airflow, it shouldn't be an issue. But just try to avoid, that mid-afternoon watering. Get out early morning, I think would be the best time to go out, check your garden, check your plants, and then give everything a good water.
Okay, let's see. A couple of people have asked, how can you tell if you need to water again? And I'm guessing that you would go down to check and see. I mean, you talked about going down 18 inches, sort of check and see how that is. I know there's a screwdriver test.
You could, yeah, screwdriver test. If you have a really long handled screwdriver, you can stick that in. If it goes in easy, if it, comes out kind of muddy where it's stuck to it, it's a good indicator. You can also tell as you're going through that wet layer of soil to when you hit dry soil. But if your plants start to look wilted, if the leaves start to get droopy, this is also something that can naturally happen during, again, our July and August, when it's 110 days, 7 days in a row. The plants can kind of start to look wilted, and this is just a tactic that these plants go through to kind of a survival mode. But definitely, if you kind of start seeing your plants get droopy, sad, wilted looking, go out and give them a drink of water.
Thank you.
Okay, let's keep on going. So now we're going to talk about specific types of gardens you may have. So container gardens really could be anything that'll hold soil. So from the trunk of that car, the hood of the car, to, whimsical things you may have around your yard, it could become a container garden. Container gardens are great for yards or people that have, really bad soil quality. Maybe you've got a lot of construction debris. You start digging, and, if you're in a new housing development, we see this a lot, where they just covered up bad soil. They covered up rocks and bricks and all kinds of things, cement, with, a few feet of some good topsoil. It might not even be that good. And maybe you just have really horrible soil quality. Maybe you have really bad drainage. Maybe it's so compacted, or maybe it doesn't hold water. Maybe you're so sandy that nothing grows in it. Container gardens are great if you're dealing with things like gophers, underground rodents and pests. And if you have limited space, so maybe you don't have room to build raised beds or put in, an in-ground bed. Container gardenings are great for apartment patios, backyard, decks and things like that. A benefit of container gardening is the soil does warm up faster, as I talked about a little bit. So that can kind of give you a jump start on earlier planting times. And container gardening allows for people that may have mobility issues, or may not be able to get out to their garden anymore. You can put a container on a table. You could find something that's tall. So everybody has an opportunity to garden. Some considerations to keep in mind with containers is that they do need more frequent watering and fertilizing. That water not only depletes through the pot, and it's a smaller area to hold on to water, but depending on the material of the pot, clay pots, for example, can suck that moisture out along with the soil and the plant roots. And so you just need to be mindful that you need to keep track of how dry your pots are getting. And then there's there's not a lot of microbial activity happening in containers, because you're typically adding, bagged potting mix and growing mix for planting mediums. So there's not a lot happening as far as nutrients go. So you do need to be mindful to add fertilizer to your containers. You still need to protect them from excessive heat and frost. And with containers, you do need to purchase new potting soil potting mix with each crop that you plant. So you don't want to use last year's pots that had last year's tomatoes to plant even anything else, zucchini or anything else in. And you don't want to use native soils. Use, again, a properly draining soil mix for your containers. Okay, so for edible plants, peppers and things like that, you could replace a third of the potting soil each season. I just go with the fresh soil each season, and that also helps if you have any diseases or anything like that in the soil. With containers, if you're not doing some type of like sterilization process, solarization, you can There's a process called solarization. But if you're not sterilizing those pots or the containers that you are in, you definitely want to do crop rotation as well to prevent any diseases that may be hanging out in those pots. So choosing your containers, you want to think about the size, you want to make sure they have a drain hole and possible portability. So if it's something that you want to move around, maybe you want to put that pot on some casters or something so that you can roll it around to bring it out in the sun during the day and bring it in at night. This works great for people that maybe live in apartments or duplexes where they want their plants to get some sunlight, but then want to bring them in for safekeeping or put them closer to the house at night. Containers don't have to be flower pots. There's lots of different ways to have container gardening. So you can do some rain gutters on the side of a shed or your garage or something like that and plant shallow rooted crops like lettuces or spinaches and things like that in it. You could have more of a windowsill type garden, baskets hanging right out your window, or galvanized buckets and baskets attached to outbuildings. Container gardening, you could literally grow tomatoes in a 5-gallon bucket with a pole that makes a great trellis. And as long as it's got a drainage hole, it'll hold soil. It'll, allow adequate root growth for those tomatoes. Wheelbarrows, you can see just some fun things, a kiddie pool, old furniture. So there's lots of different things that you can use as containers. Raised beds kind of go the same way. There's lots of different materials that you can use to make raised garden beds. Here's just some more pictures. The taller ones are great, again, for mobility issues. Anybody that's in like a wheelchair that may not be able to bend over or get to an in-ground garden, you can build and design them to the height that works for the gardener. So some benefits of raised garden beds. Again, they're great for gardens with poor soil, poor water drainage. And you do have a jump start on all of us in-ground gardeners of your soil typically warming up faster, which allows for some earlier planting. You can build your raised garden beds to support row covers. So on the inside or the outside of your raised garden bed, you can attach even just some PVC pipe, and you can make your own row covers with some smaller gauge PVC pipe to make arches that would go over the top. And then you can throw over some, again, shade cloth or plastic, turn them into your own little mini greenhouse. And, it's not a permanent thing. A lot of times raised beds will make a yard look maybe a little bit tidier and, again, not permanent. You can easily tear them apart and put something else in the spot of those vegetable beds. So there's many different materials that you can use to build raised beds. You want something to keep in mind is try not to make them any wider than 4 feet across or whatever the reach of your arms are. So you want to make sure you can reach halfway across. And this allows you to reach the middle of your garden beds without having to climb into the beds, to harvest things that might be growing along the middle. It's always good to add a hardware cloth at the bottom, especially if you have gophers, moles, voles, things like that, because they will come up, they can come up, and they can eat the roots of your vegetable plants. And avoid using railroad ties. That's one thing that I would say avoid using, because they do contain a lot of chemicals that can leach into your soil as well as your plants. Anything that's pre-treated lumber all has chemicals and things like that in it that potentially would leach into the soil, that potentially could get into your plants. I see this a lot. This is a very Pinteresty thing. I see it floating around Facebook and other social media outlets of pallet gardens. I think this is great. People, they stack pallets to make raised beds. You can grow things vertically in them. You can keep a tidy garden by planting in between them, as you see in that picture. But there are some words of caution when it comes to pallet gardens. You definitely want to make sure you're using clean pallets, that they don't have spills, paint, unidentifiable objects, grease, things like that on it. You're going to want to look for the IPPC logo stamped on it along with the words HT. And I'm going to talk more about that at the next slide. Avoid using colored pallets. So often like blue pallets, for example, they may look whimsical and fun, but they're often treated or often used to haul chemicals. So maybe they hauled chlorine, for pools or something like that. And that's not something that you'd want to plant your plants in. Look up the stamps on your pallets. If you've ever looked closely at the ends or the sides of a pallet, you'll see numbers and letters on them. And those are all things that you can look up online to see where they came from, what they were used for originally. If you can't read them, don't use them. And keep in mind, if you're thinking about doing a pallet garden, you know, especially for edibles, a lot of people will plant, you know, I think for flowers and things like that, you don't have these same issues, but for anything that you're going to be eating, where's that pallet been? So just because it might meet the criteria with it's clean and it's got all the proper markings, but who else has used that pallet and what did they use it for? And then please note that all, you know, stamps, again, may not be clear on the pallets, and if you can't read them, don't use them. So a little bit more about that IPPC logo. That is the International Plant Protection Convention stamp. And what that means is that these pallets were used to haul international shipments, and it means that they would not and should not be carrying any invasive pests or species or plant diseases. So when I said look for that HT also along with the IPPC logo, HT means that wood was heat treated for at least 30 minutes. It gets to a certain temperature, which kills diseases, pests, things like that. If you see an MB on your pallet, do not use that. That pallet was treated with methyl bromide. And even though that's not something that is available now, you'll still see pallets out there with that MB on it, meaning that it was treated with methyl bromide to kill invasive insect species and plant diseases. So just some things to keep in mind as you're considering using a pallet for a garden. Vertical gardens are also another way that you can go with gardens. You can grow up. And here's just some inspirational pictures. You can make a teepee for kids, you know, with some climbing pole beans. The picture on the right is some cucumber that somebody built a trellis for, and then they've got maybe some lettuces or something growing underneath that would benefit from the shade that those cucumbers are going to provide those lower plants. So some benefits of growing vertically: you do use less space because you're growing up. It's easier on the knees. So if you have a hard time bending over and your back, you don't have to bend over for the most part. You kind of just harvest at eye level and below, up and below. A lot of times with vertical garden, we see higher yields, and that's because you have better air circulation. You've got air flowing through there. Everything's getting sunlight. You know, if you've grown cucumbers on the ground horizontally, for example, they can get very dense. A lot of times with plants will get powdery mildews and molds, and that's because we've got moisture, we've got humidity, and we don't have enough air getting in there and drying things out. Vertical, we get a lot of good air circulation, a lot of sunlight, and fewer weeds. You're only, you know, watering at the base of the plant, so you're not dealing with watering like furrow irrigation, for example. Furrows where you make the long rows that you fill up with water adjacent to your plants. And you know, those can get very weedy because you're watering a large area. Vertical, you're just watering a certain area. Again, the likelihood of snails, you know, decimating the whole plant is less likely because you're going up and the snails aren't going to climb a whole plant to get to something. You can even go vertical with some things that you may not think about going vertical with, like melons. So you can use mesh produce type bags as support. Nylons, you can make slings for watermelons and cantaloupes, things that are heavy. Doesn't have to just be cucumbers and bitter melons and things like that. But if you can trellis it and you know, loosely tie to a fence or some type of trellis system, you can definitely grow melons. The last picture there with the white, those are like old t-shirts that they made little hammocks and just tied them onto some heavy gauge fencing material. You can also come up with some fun trellis type systems. So bike wheels with some string would be great for some pole runner beans. You know, old bed frames would make anything out in the garden where things can grow vertically. You can train plants to grow up them. So just add some fun element. And again, it's a good space saver if you're limited on space. Certain plants can sprawl and become very invasive in the garden. So sometimes it's also helpful to train them up so that they don't take over your other plants. This just shows growing some snap peas. on some heavy duty concrete reinforcing type mesh that they went vertical with some rebarb, and then, or you could use anything, but you just want to make sure that this is sturdy. And they were able to grow those snap peas, as you can see in the picture, nice and vertical, nice and tall, and nice and uniform. So it makes for easy harvesting. You can see this person had some cardboard down the middle of the rows,
Who that?
and makes for easy harvest and easy access. And we just want to make sure we are all muted, please. Thank you very much. So just some other types of gardens that I'm not going to talk about, but our Master Gardener program could definitely help answer these questions, or your local Master Gardener program. Square foot gardening is very popular. That's where you take maybe like a raised garden bed and measure off square foot sections. And then there's information online where you can figure out how many of certain types of plants you can grow in a square foot. Straw bale gardening, as shown in the picture. That's another type of gardening method where you condition a bale of straw and you can grow directly into that straw bale. Hydroponic gardening, and then again, edible landscaping, were all just different methods of growing vegetables. So any questions? I think that's it for what I have. So I'm going to stop screen sharing.